here in Peru, we have received a large Chinese investment. Chinese company Costco Shipping is going to build a Chancay port. It's going to be, well, they say it's going to be a hub here in Latin America, this port. And it's going to cost around $3 billion. Yeah, it's going to be the biggest investment in a port in Peru. Yes.
That will be very helpful to Peruvian exports.
Yes, exactly, because we have the biggest port is Callao here in Lima, and it's already
Overcapacity.
On full, right?
Yeah.
It's already, overcapacity, exactly. Yes, and this will be very helpful. Hope it will be built in 3 years or so. Yes.
Well,
so this port is part of the Belt and Road Initiative. Yes.
Excellent.
Okay, Maria, let's begin. It's already time. Okay.
Okay.
Let's begin, Maria.
Okay. Shall I begin, right? Yeah. Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Today we have the honor to have as a lecturer to Professor Ross. Professor Robert Ross is Professor of Political Science at Boston College and Associate Yonkin Fairbank Center for Chinese Studies, Harvard University. He received his PhD in Political Science from Columbia University in 1984. He has taught at Columbia University and at the University of Washington, and in 1989 was a guest scholar at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. In 1994 to 1995, he was Fulbright professor at the Chinese Foreign Affairs College. In 2003, he was a visiting senior fellow at the Institute of International Strategic Studies at Tsinghua University in Beijing. And in 2014, was a visiting scholar of the School of International Relations of Peking University. In 2009, he was visiting scholar of the Institute for Strategy of the Royal Danish Defense College. From 2009 to 2014, he has been adjunct professor of the Institute for Defense Studies of the Norwegian Defense University College. Professor Ross' research focuses on Chinese security policy and defense policy, East Asian security, and US-China relations. His recent publications include Chinese security policy, structure, power and politics, China ascent, power, security, and the future of international politics, and new directions in the study of Chinese foreign policy. His other major works include normalization of US-China relations and international history, Great Wall and Empty Fortress, China's search for security, negotiating cooperation, US-China relations from 1969 to 1989, and the Indochina Tangle, China's Vietnam policy. Professor Ross is the author of numerous articles in World Politics, the China Quarterly, and the International Security, the Security Studies, Orbis, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, the National Interest, and Asian Survey. His books and articles have been translated in China, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, and various European countries. And lastly, Professor Ross has testified before various Senate and House committees and the Defense Policy Board Advisory Committee. He advises US government agencies, and he serves on the Academic Advisory Group, US-China Working Group, United States Congress. He is a
Sorry, there was an interruption. Okay, we're again. Yeah, okay. In fact, it is an honor to host Professor Robert Ross, and he will talk about China foreign policy. Before giving the floor to Professor Ross, just allow me to give some words. I'm Carlos Aquino, Director of the Center of Asian Studies. Our center was established with the purpose of studying the Asian regions to understand better and to propose public policy to have a better diplomatic relationship, economic relationship with that country. All the conferences that we are having are recorded, and you can see it again in the Facebook page of our center. And so I ask you to visit our center to see not only this conference, but all the conferences that we have done up to now, okay? I just ask you to mute your microphone, and if you have any question, you can write it in the chat, and we're going to read it and to present to Professor Ross. That's all for my part, and now I give the floor to Professor Ross. Please, Professor. You're mute, Professor, you're mute.
Thank you, Professor Aquino. It's an honor to be talking to colleagues in Peru. China is clearly a world power. Interest in China is around the world. And for me, the opportunity to speak around the world is a benefit. And so I'm very happy to be here today, even if by Zoom. And I hope one day we can meet in person. I have a very big topic today. The topic is Chinese foreign policy. Well, what I want to talk about today is China as a great power, a rising power in the international political system. So when I talk about Chinese foreign policy, I am not going to give a policy perspective from the United States. The American Washington, D.C. perspective is all about what China is doing to America and what America must do in response. Well, that does not help us understand China. It doesn't help us understand why China is doing what they're doing. It simply is an American national interest perspective. Moreover, when Americans are concerned about the rise of China, they tend to place value judgments. So you'll hear America say China good or bad. China's aggressive, China's belligerent, China's coercive. I don't think that's very helpful either in understanding China. On the contrary, when we say China is belligerent or aggressive, it makes it very difficult for countries to negotiate because you can't cooperate with an aggressive country. So I will not have a policy perspective, nor will I have an attempt to understand China good or bad. What I want to do is understand China as a player, an actor in international politics like any other country. And I want to understand US-China politics, great power politics, in the context of China's rise in the international system. So I first want to say that everything we read about China today, I find perfectly understandable and behavior that we should expect from a rising power. Now let's understand, China is indeed a rising power. We may say indeed that China is no longer a rising power. China is already a great power, and a global power in some respects, but it's still getting stronger. Now, when we say rising power, getting stronger, in the world of international politics and security affairs, we're talking about military power. I do not spend much attention to economic power because I think it's quite clear, particularly in East Asia, that China became an economic great power maybe 20 years ago. But no one spoke about China as a rising power creating instability 20 years ago, that's relatively new. And relatively new that America has been concerned about rising China, and that's because of the rise of Chinese military power. So when I think about China as a rising power and US-China great power politics and the power transition, I think about China's military power. And I think about China's relative military power. I do not focus on whether the Chinese army is getting more modern or larger. I focus on whether or not it is closing the gap in the United States and China. So we care about relative power. And it should be clear that China is indeed closing the gap, and it is indeed a rising power, and we are in a power transition. Now, how did this happen? Well, it happened because China developed the economics, the wealth, the money, and the technology to build a navy and missiles and aircraft that could compete with the US Navy, US missiles, and US aircraft. Well, in this respect, Chinese military power that we care about as a rising power is its maritime power. We need to remember, and this is not frequently understood, that after the Cold War, and remember, China won the Cold War in East Asia, not the United States. China resisted the Soviet Union in East Asia, not the United States. The United States lost the war in Vietnam. We retreated from Vietnam. We retreated from Cambodia. We retreated from Laos and Thailand and Burma. But China continued to compete with an arms race on the border with the Soviet Union in the war in Vietnam. And when the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union retreated from East Asia, China filled the vacuum. China expanded where the Soviet Union used to be. And the result was, at the end of the Cold War, China was the dominant land power throughout East Asia. China had hegemony in continental East Asia. But the United States was the dominant maritime power in East Asia. It was the only country in East Asia with a great power navy. China had no navy. So the United States had hegemony in maritime East Asia, and China had hegemony in continental East Asia. And then all that water between these two big spheres of influence, East Asia was the most peaceful country in the world from basically 1989 to the present. It remains the most peaceful region in the world from 1989 to the present, because China had its hegemony and America had its hegemony. Well, rising power means that China has to develop maritime power to challenge American hegemony in maritime East Asia, and that's what we're witnessing. No one in the United States writes about the Chinese army. We don't care about the Chinese army. We care a little about their missiles, a little about their aircraft, but we really care about their navy. And so we see rising China challenging the status quo in the East Asian maritime security order that used to be unipolar, used to be American hegemony, and we're seeing a bipolar system emerge. So China is rising. Well, what does China want? What's it doing with its power? What's its objective? Well, it should be clear. China is a revisionist power. China wants to reconfigure, to change, to revise the regional security order of East Asia. It doesn't want American hegemony in maritime East Asia. Now, this should not be surprising to anyone. Does this make China aggressive? No. Does it make it belligerent? No. It means that China, now that it has more naval power, it wants more security. And what is the status quo? The status quo is America has naval and air force bases and ground force bases in South Korea and Japan, and naval bases de facto in Singapore and Philippines and Malaysia. So the American Navy, the Americans have allies or security partners surrounding China's coastal waters, with air bases and naval bases surrounding coastal waters of China, with alliances that are aimed at China, with America controlling the waters around China. It should not be surprising that China wants to change that situation. That's not belligerent, that's not aggressive, that's what any rising power would want to do. China is a dissatisfied power. And so let's be clear. China is using its power to challenge American security alliances in East Asia. That is its purpose. That is not an accusation. That is not a criticism. That is what China is doing because it wants to weaken American maritime capabilities on China's periphery. And the way you do that is to weaken American alliances and to weaken America's ability to use its bases in East Asia to contain China. And just so we remember, the Americans throughout the Cold War and the post-Cold War have used this dominance of the South China Sea and the East China Sea to carry out espionage activities within Chinese waters. We fought wars in Vietnam, we fought wars in Korea. So China certainly has experience in how America uses its military supremacy to undermine Chinese security. Now, China has done this very successfully. We must compliment China and its leaders for their pragmatism. So Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao, died in 1976. Deng Xiaoping took over in December 1978. And it was China waited 40 years before it began to develop its military. For 40 years, it developed technology and economics to slowly build the foundation for military power. But then beginning in about 2012 or 13, China started building ships, a lot of ships, very, very quickly. And very modern ships, very capable ships. We used to, in the old days, we would count how big ships were and how many aircraft they carry. Today, we count ships by how many missiles they carry. And Chinese ships carry a lot of missiles, and they're good missiles. By building these ships and these missiles, China has now narrowed the gap and challenged American maritime supremacy in both quantity and quality. China is a rising power. China now has the largest Navy in the world, larger than the American Navy. And the gap continues to close because the Chinese are building ships at a much, much faster rate than the United States. On the one hand, China is growing the size of its Navy, and the American Navy is getting smaller. It is getting smaller because American ships are old. So we can no longer keep them in operation. So we are removing ships from the Navy, and our Navy is getting smaller, and China's Navy is getting bigger. And China's ships have a lot of missiles on them, and their submarines are very good. So the Americans now are no longer confident that it can compete with China if there were a war. Moreover, China has developed very good missiles. Now, missiles are not very hard. So what are Chinese missiles for? Well, the missiles on their ships are aimed at American ships. Very good. But China also has developed land missiles that are aimed at American bases in South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, Singapore, Malaysia. What does that mean? That means these bases are no longer useful for the United States. They could disappear in a day if there was a US-China war. Remember, we're talking war here because that's why the United States has allies. That's why we have bases, ultimately, for war. But now these allies and these bases are no longer valuable because China's power has risen. China's missiles can now destroy these bases. So, rising China, large Navy, effective missiles. The missiles target American bases in the Philippines, South Korea. So how does China use its power? Well, this is a very old tradition of great powers. China is carrying out gunboat diplomacy. China's Navy is everywhere in East Asia. It is in the Yellow Sea near South Korea. It is in the Sea of East China Sea near Japan. It's in the South China Sea near the Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore, Vietnam, and it's always there, always. And every so often, it will go very close to a country's 12-mile limit. And so if you're sitting in the Philippines, you see China's Navy on your borders, and it makes you nervous. What China's doing with its Navy and Coast Guard, always present, is that it's raising the cost and threat perception of countries when they cooperate with the United States. That Navy is intimidating. What happens if you challenge China? And what does challenge China mean? It means cooperate with the United States against China. And so the Chinese Navy becomes especially present, especially intimidating. Its Coast Guard becomes quite threatening when countries cooperate with the United States. And so China creates crises with Vietnam when Vietnam is drilling for oil in waters China says belongs to China. It's not a crisis for China because Vietnam really doesn't have a Navy, but it's a crisis for Vietnam. When the Philippines cooperates with the United States to challenge Chinese territorial claims, all of a sudden the Chinese Navy is harassing, the Coast Guard is harassing Vietnamese fishing boats, and the Chinese Coast Guard is everywhere near Philippine claimed waters. South Korea. When South Korea cooperated with the United States to deploy missiles and to deploy a missile defense system that could target China, all of a sudden the Yellow Sea became a little unstable with Chinese ships. So what China's saying is, with gunboat diplomacy, do not cooperate with the United States, or we will increase and escalate the pressure on you. And look at other countries. Malaysia has no problem with China. It doesn't cooperate with the United States. Singapore has no problem with China. It doesn't cooperate with the United States against China. Vietnam and the Philippines now have cooperation with China because they stopped cooperating with the United States against Chinese territorial claims. China does not demand that these countries accept Chinese sovereignty. China doesn't care. The islands, just to be clear, are worthless. And there's no energy resources near the islands. China simply says, you don't have to accept our claims, recognize Chinese sovereignty, but do not cooperate with the United States to challenge Chinese claims. Now, this is gunboat diplomacy. On the one hand, the challenge to American security is quite significant. Since World War II, of course, the United States, or since the end of the Korean War, US security policy in East Asia, the cornerstones of that policy were American alliances with Philippines, Japan, South Korea, and our strategic partnerships with Singapore and Malaysia. China is challenging those security partnerships and thereby challenging American security policy. On the other hand, relatively speaking, from an historical perspective, China's gunboat diplomacy is fairly moderate, not particularly aggressive. There are no wars, no attacks on countries with their aircraft, no naval hostilities. China has not killed anyone as a rising power. It's simply reminding other countries that China is powerful and they need to be careful. Now compare that, of course, forgive me if I sound a little bit American leftist here, but America has been fighting wars in the Middle East for the last 20 years nonstop, last 30 years nonstop, refugees all over the Middle East, Somalia, Yemen, Syria, Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, wars in the former Yugoslavia. Greatest refugee crises in the world was Syria. So that if we want to assign and use value judgments, belligerent, aggressive, China looks fairly moderate in pursuing interests that seem typical of a great power wanting greater security. That's different than saying the United States should accept it. Of course, the United States will not accept it because its security is declining and it will compete and try and maintain its position. But that's different than saying China's aggressive or belligerent, expected behavior of a rising power. Now we have to ask ourselves, what are the results of Chinese policy? Have they been successful? And one has to say that China has been very, very successful. In recent years, people have said that China maybe has overplayed its hand. Countries are angry at China for being too aggressive. Or China management of COVID undermined its respect around the world. Or China's human rights policies are undermining China's presence in the world. No, absolutely true. There is a lot of talk around the world about human rights in Xinjiang or the Hong Kong policy, and a lot of talk around the world about how China suppressed news of COVID in the first 2 or 3 weeks. That's absolutely true. And certainly there are countries in Southeast Asia or elsewhere that are critical of China's gumbo diplomacy. But we should understand that these are speeches, these are public opinion polls, these are articles in newspapers, in editorials. And in the world I live in, none of this matters. None. To give you an example, in the American presidential election, the importance of foreign policy in China was way down at the bottom of the list of things important to China, important to the American voter in the election. It's the same in every country around the world. Voters, citizens care very little about foreign policy when they judge their president. They care about the economy and government services, healthcare, these kind of things. Second, everything is relative, like I said earlier. Well, if we think of the US-China competition and the criticism of China and its impact, we think about the impact of the criticism compared and the impact on the US-China competition. Is China now in retreat because of its bad policies? Well, everything is relative. I would say compared to 4 years of Donald Trump, China looks pretty good. Countries that are comparing China to Donald Trump probably think China looks a lot better. China has not attacked multilateralism. It has not attacked international organizations. It has not started trade wars with its allies or with its neighbors. United States has done all that. Trade wars with Mexico and Canada and Japan and South Korea and Europe and China. And of course, it walked away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. China did a poor job dealing with COVID in the first 2 or 3 weeks, but regarding the impact on the United States, President Trump's policies were far worse. 6 weeks of doing nothing, and like the leadership of China, covering up bad news about COVID for his personal political interests. The impact on American health was far worse than anything China did. So relatively speaking, China's diplomacy looks a lot better than American diplomacy. And so even during the Trump administration and the last 2 years during COVID, China has continued to succeed. How is it done? Well, in the US-China maritime balance, the gap between the United States and China continues to grow. The American Navy is getting smaller, the Chinese Navy is getting bigger. Finally, this year, the Americans are beginning to spend more money on its Navy. The United States no longer feels they can operate in the South China Sea at an acceptable cost in a war. American allies, they're all running away from the United States. They are moving toward equidistance between the United States and China. They have all made clear that they will not choose sides in the US-China great power competition. Singapore, Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam have all now said they do not want to choose sides in the United States and America. In the past, they chose the American side. Now they say they don't want to choose sides. That means they're not as friendly to the United States as they used to be, and they're friendlier toward China. America is watching its alliances erode, weaken, and it continued through the Trump administration. China's shipbuilding rates are much, much faster than the United States, and we should be clear the United States has no money. We are spending a lot of money on healthcare, unemployment benefits, stimulus for COVID, economic programs to deal with COVID. We have very expensive Social Security, very expensive Medicare and Medicaid, very expensive healthcare programs. It will be very difficult for the United States to spend enough money to compete with the rise of China. Even as China expands its navy and reaches new economic agreements and diplomatic agreements with other countries. The RCEP agreement, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, a major new economic free trade agreement. While the United States is launching trade wars, China has been quite successful with the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. It has a new investment agreement with Europe, the EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment. The United States made clear, President Biden made clear that he did not want the Europeans to sign this agreement. But the Europeans said, we don't care, this is a good agreement for us, and we expect that it will not get better, it may get worse if we do not accept it, and we do not want to be part of the American negotiations with China over trade. So China got a new agreement with Europe at the expense of the United States. And China's Belt and Road Initiative is still quite popular around the world. So while America is on the defensive, its military power is relatively declining, China is still expanding its influence around the world as its economic and military power continues to grow. So we now have a US-China power transition, and power transitions are always difficult. The most difficult job, most difficult responsibility in international politics is to integrate a rising power into the international system. And the US-China relationship is going to be very difficult. Now, if you watch China, China is all about cooperation, with the United States too. They want cooperation and stability. Of course they do. Because cooperation and stability makes it easier for them to rise, create stability around the world while they can build their economy, build their influence, and build their military. That's what all rising powers want. The United States, on the other hand, wants to challenge the contemporary trend. It doesn't want pure cooperation and stability because that makes it too easy for China. It wants to weaken China's ability to rise, and therefore it has to challenge China. Challenge China with economics, challenge China with military power, create global coalitions against China. So the United States is the country, let's be clear, that is contributing to international tension, not China. That's not because China's nice or China's good, but because it's in its interest to keep stability so it can grow faster. Stability makes it easier to expand relations with Korea and Singapore, the Philippines, Japan, and Europe, whereas conflict would make it more difficult. So what is the challenge for China? China's challenge is to continue to rise, but not to signal the United States or other countries that it has unlimited objectives, that it wants hegemony in East Asia, that it wants to take over the global economy and make other countries poorer. It has to avoid signaling other countries that it has unlimited expansion, because then it could stimulate escalation of tension and risk of global trade wars and real war. What is the challenge for the United States? The United States must compete with China. Let's see. The United States and China are the two great powers in the world. Competition is inevitable. The United States is going to try and maintain its position. China's going to try and continue to grow. And the two great powers in the world, the two most powerful countries, are never friends. They're always competitors. The United States must try to compete with China without signaling China that it is trying to contain China. Because if it signals it's trying to contain China and push China back, that will make China more hostile. And it will make China impatient. It will provoke Chinese nationalism. So America needs to be restrained and also find ways to cooperate. China needs to be restrained, and it must be patient. Where's the Biden administration going? We don't know yet. Let's be clear, the Biden administration's come into power very aggressive against China. Its Taiwan policy is more assertive and aggressive than Trump's. Its signals about the trade war show no signs of cooperation. It continues to say that China wants to overthrow the global order, which of course is not true. So the signaling is of containment. But we don't know whether that is what the Biden administration is doing because it wants to establish its resolve, its credibility when it's still a new administration, and then it will ultimately become more cooperative. We do not know if it's talking to Republicans to try and weaken their attacks on the Biden administration from being weak on China. We don't know if it's aimed around the world to try and build a coalition. I do know that if this trend continues, it will be a continuation of Trump administration policy that treated China like a rising hegemon that challenged American interests around the world and that upset the global order. And that will contribute to heightened US-China conflict. None of that's necessary. The Cold War to the United States and the Soviet Union was an exception. No one is worried about a Chinese attack on the Philippines or South Korea, the way the Americans worried about a Russian attack on Germany. The fear of war is not so great. The ideological battles are not so great. Economic cooperation is quite strong. The US-China relationship is one in which we can compete as two great powers, but still cooperate and avoid a Cold War and polarization. That's our objective. But it requires Chinese patience and Chinese restraint, and it requires American restraint in competing with a willingness to cooperate. Now, I spoke very little. I spoke nothing about China and Peru and China and Latin America, for which I apologize. But I will try and answer any questions I can about those subjects also. Thank you, Professor Aquino.
Thanks, Professor Ross. Very interesting, comprehensive lecture about China foreign policy. Yeah, you refer, most of the time about China rise, and especially focused in the East Asian region. And it's quite natural. China presence there is very big, and it's have been natural for China to be the dominant power until 200 years ago. That is a fact, okay? And also, it is natural to focus in that area because previous to the China becoming more assertive, United States from the Second World War was the growing power there, but now that situation is being challenged by China. So it's natural to think United States, China rivalry in this area. But then I would like to comment or ask you anyway a question about China influencing other countries, specifically in the developing countries. You know, as you know, China is already the biggest export partner from many countries, for more than half of the countries of the world, especially developing countries. Look at countries in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America. China is the biggest market, and it's becoming the biggest market already in Latin American region. If you not consider Mexico, that have a very strong relationship with the United States, already China is the biggest partner of Latin America, except Mexico, okay? And also it can be the case in Africa, most of Africa, many countries. Not only that, not only in the case of China as a major destination for the product, China is also becoming the biggest investor, and of course, it's the biggest lender also. Even China lends more than many international financial institutions. So the question is how China influence is going to grow there, and if as it seems the United States want to challenge China growing presence in Asia. That's going to happen also. United States would like to challenge China growing presence in Latin America, in Africa, for example. That's going to be the case. What do you think about that?
Well, I think two things. One, China as an aid country, whether it's the Belt and Road Initiative, whether it's the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, whether it's the Chinese Import-Export Bank, China has become the dominant source of new aid funds around the world. So, for example, there is the Asian Development Bank, the ADB in East Asia, where Japan is the president, but they have very little new funding. The source of new funds around the world is China. American aid budget is not going to grow a lot. We say we want to compete, but we're really not. The World Bank doesn't have many new funds. Most of its money is already lent out. So China is the most important country in the world for development aid in the developing countries. And in some ways, we have to recognize that as a good thing. Thank goodness China is helping the world develop. As an American, and let us be clear, the most important part of development is infrastructure. And China is doing a lot of work on infrastructure. We can criticize China because frequently in Africa and other countries, Pakistan, it is doing infrastructure investment and loans with corrupt governments, with no conditions, but it's getting the roads built. And ultimately that may be more important than trying to promote political change when countries remain poor and backward. Second, so that's a good thing, I think. And I think the implications for America are very minor. I think the more important question is, why does China want to do development aid? I think it's a question of status, prestige, but it's important. Regarding trade, I did a little research, Professor Aquino, on trade, and I discovered, I think, the only country in Latin America where China is the major trading partner is Venezuela. So, for example, Mexico sends about 75% of its exports to the United States. For all of Latin America and the Caribbean, America takes 40% of Latin America, Caribbean exports. That was 2 years ago. China is only about a little more than 10%. So when we think of the importance of markets for countries' growth and development, the United States remains the dominant economic country in Latin America. Venezuela is the exception, and I think for two reasons. One is because of oil. The United States does not import oil. And then second, because of American trade sanctions against Venezuela. The number one trade country for Venezuela is India, and then after India, it's China. So even in economic terms, China is not a major player, if you will. Or I shouldn't say that. Compared to the United States, China is a minor player in the Latin American export economies. And this is not surprising. Countries trade with their neighbors. They always have and always will. So we think of China's trade with Europe as growing from the Belt and Road and the port facilities. China is a very insignificant country for European trade. Germany and Poland trade, France and Germany trade, Italy trades with France. They trade with each other. The minor exception is the importance of German exports to China, but that's because when we measure exports, we measure machinery exports for factories and investment. In terms of, so that China's, Germany is investing a lot in China, and that shows up in export numbers. In reality, China takes very little of European consumer goods, manufacturing, and so forth. The third thing to keep in mind is when China invests around the world, it tends to buy, at least in the United States and Europe, and perhaps in Latin America too, it tends to buy companies in these countries to invest. Now, it does that in Europe and in the United States to buy access to their economies and to buy technology, but they're not creating jobs because they're buying factories that already have those jobs. So that China's investments are not contributing in the United States or Europe and many other countries to the prosperity and growth of those countries because they're buying companies that already exist. Now, building ports and infrastructure can help, but once the infrastructure is built, China goes away. So that then it becomes owned by the country that has to pay back the loan, and China's presence diminishes. So I think China as a global economic powerhouse with a large market is exaggerated. It will help countries, but they will primarily trade with themselves and their neighbors. The exception is China in East Asia and Central Asia. China will dominate those markets the same way the United States dominates Mexico and Canada. The countries trade with their neighbors. And China is already the hub, the anchor, the cornerstone of the East Asian economic order because its market is so large and it's growing so fast, and nothing the United States can do can stop that. Our market is smaller and it's growing much slower.
Thanks, Professor. So I guess, yeah, you mentioned that still United States is the biggest market for Latin American export, but I guess if you exclude Mexico, because 80%, 70% of all export of Latin America are Mexicans. If you take out Mexico,
yes,
already China is the biggest export market for Latin America, I guess. So if you take out Mexico.
You see, Professor Aquino, that's why I did not speak about China and Latin America. Because I only embarrass myself. Thank you.
Anyway, well, I would like to do some questions, but there are some questions in the chat, so I will give
thank you
to them. So please, Maria, can you read the question in the chat?
Yes, okay. Yes, we have some questions on the Zoom.
Okay,
chat.
yeah.
This is from Ariela Ruiz. It
Okay.
says, what does Professor Robert Ross think about the U.S. reincorporation to the Trans-Pacific Partnership? What does he think about the recent association between USA, India, Japan, and Australia? What kind of association is that? What are they looking for? I mean the so-called Quad grouping.
Quad.
So there are two questions. One is on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the other is
Yes.
on the so-called Quad.
Yeah.
I think the United States would like to join these associations, but the American domestic politics makes it just so difficult. And I do not think that President Biden will use his political capital to persuade the American Congress to agree to joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, we need to be clear. The Trans-Pacific Partnership has minor implications for American economic interests. Again, I'll say it again. The Chinese market is 5 times larger than the American market and growing 3 to 4 times faster. So the United States cannot compete with China as an economic market in East Asia. And no agreement is going to help. It was a political effort, the TPP, to establish America's commitment to remain an Asian power in the context of the rise of China. And then we walked away from it, which did more harm than possible if we had never agreed to it in the first place. A major mistake. But now we are not going to be able to rejoin. The economic benefits are small. Our unions will resist, and the American Congress will be a major opposition to trying to reach an agreement. It's unfortunate, but that's the reality. Regarding the Quad is very interesting. So the Quad is a diplomatic arrangement for the leaders of those four countries or their foreign ministers or joint delegations of foreign ministers and security officials to meet to talk about how to cooperate. But it's really not very important. It's just a way for diplomats to meet and talk. But it is interesting because it is the diplomatic equivalent to the US Indo-Pacific strategy. So the Pentagon calls it the Indo-Pacific strategy. The Pentagon, the State Department calls it the Quad. Same countries. The Indo-Pacific strategy is heavy reliance on India, Australia, and Japan. Now, why is that the case? Because, as I said in my talk, the United States no longer can trust its allies inside East Asia. Philippines is not reliable. Singapore is not reliable. South Korea is not reliable. Malaysia is not reliable. They're too close to China. They feel Chinese naval pressure every day. The balance of power is changing within East Asia. So America is now looking for strategic partners outside of the East Asian seas, far from China, where it can have military facilities that are secure to enable it to dominate the Indian Ocean and Western Pacific. That is Australia, India, and Japan. And if you really look carefully, the United States is becoming very interested in the Indian islands called Andaman. Why? Because they're near the Straits of Malacca, just on the other side of the South China Sea. All these little islands around the South China Sea, outside of it, America is now developing capabilities. So America is pulling out of the South China Sea because we know we cannot compete. And the Quad is our new defense strategy. We call that the Indo-Pacific strategy. And I think it's quite possible. India is very happy to cooperate with the United States. We used to say India was a non-aligned country and would never cooperate. Well, the threat of China in the Indian Ocean, India is now interested in cooperating. We have new military agreements with India. The US has flown its aircraft into Andaman. We had some small naval cooperation. Australia is cooperating more. Japan will always cooperate more. So I think the Indo-Pacific strategy is really the right way for America to go. We should realize we're falling behind in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and we need to retreat a little bit to the Indian Ocean and the Western Pacific.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Now we have one more question from Sebastian Adins. He says, "Good night, Professor Ross. I agree that the naval power of China has increased hugely in recent years, but hasn't the country a huge geopolitical problem? Comparing to the US, by having 14 direct neighbors and no direct access to the world oceans? Moreover, China has 2 aircraft carriers. The US have 11 of them. Don't you think that strategic parity will still take a couple of decades?"
Thank you. Yes, I used to argue that. I wrote an article 20 years ago that said China would not be a naval power because it has 14 neighbors. And I was wrong. I was wrong because, one, I failed to understand just how much of a failure Russia would be. It never recovered, it never recovered, it never recovered. And so if you look at, to give you an example, if you look at the relationship between Russia and China in Northeast Asia, in the Far East, Russia looks like Canada to America. China doesn't care about Russia. 7 million people up there. It can dominate that so easily without lifting a finger. So it doesn't have to spend a lot of money on its army to deal with Russia. Its army is fine to deal with Russia. And so it started spending more money on its navy. No one's fighting a war between China and India at 15,000 feet in the Himalayas. It's just not possible. Too cold, The middle of the mountains, so it's a problem, but it's not a major problem for China's defense budget. Vietnam's not a problem, Burma's not a problem, Laos is not a problem, North Korea is not a problem, Mongolia. These are all little countries. So that China, unlike Germany, for example, or unlike France, it now looks like the United States in the beginning of the 20th century. It's dominated its continent, it's become the hegemon, and now it can build a navy. So I think we're seeing one of the unique countries in history that can be a naval power when it's not an island, when it's not Japan, when it's not India. It can be a continental hegemon and be a naval power. And China's doing that, and it's quite successful. And of course, it has many, many good ports. Good ports in Hainan Island, good ports in Shanghai, good ports in Fujian, good ports in Shandong Peninsula and Qingdao, good ports in the Northeast in Dalian, and in many, many good ports. And they're fairly secure. So that that's not a problem. Now, the aircraft carrier is interesting in two respects. If you look at what the United States is saying today, there is a big debate and a big battle within the Pentagon as to whether the United States should be building any more aircraft carriers and whether we should take aircraft carriers and reduce the number of carriers we have. One, because they're very vulnerable. They're big and slow and they're easy to sink. And if you sink a big aircraft carrier, you have lost 55 planes and a lot of money and a lot of soldiers. And second, what is an aircraft carrier for? To carry aircraft. And why do we have aircraft to have missiles? Do we really need planes to deliver? That's all aircraft are today. They're missile platforms. Why can't you use a ship to launch a missile? So smaller ships can launch a lot of missiles, and they're more secure and they cost a lot less money. So that even though America may have more aircraft carriers, it's not clear that that's an advantage for the United States. In East Asia, I should say. So of course, the second thing is America has aircraft carriers because we're far away from Europe and Asia. So we have to take our power from Western Hemisphere and move it to Europe and move it to East Asia. And we did that with aircraft carriers. China doesn't need that. China's in the region. So it doesn't need an aircraft carrier to deal with the Taiwan Strait. It doesn't need an aircraft carrier to deal with the Korean Peninsula. It doesn't need an aircraft carrier to deal with Vietnam. And it doesn't need an aircraft carrier to deal with, say, even Singapore or the Philippines, because this aircraft can go back and forth from its own bases. So aircraft carriers are not essential to China's security interests in East Asia. Now, if China wants to be a global power with a presence in the Persian Gulf or the Mediterranean, maybe aircraft carriers would be important. But China could never put aircraft carriers into the Mediterranean because they'd be too vulnerable. Think of all the NATO bases that surround the Mediterranean. So maybe for the Persian Gulf. But they're big, they're expensive, and they're vulnerable. And it seems the military technology is moving away from aircraft carriers and towards ships that are fast with a lot of missiles on them.
Thank you, Professor Ross. There is one last question.
I see two more questions.
Yeah, I see. Yeah. Here is, this is from Miguel Palacios. Is there a considerable dimension of China's soft power projection and cultural investment in the Latin American region? How significant is the soft power projection for an upcoming hegemon? Thank you.
Well, first, I do not think soft power is very important because I do not know how often countries say, oh, we like that country's movies or their food, and therefore we will be nice to them. I don't think countries make decisions on whether they like a culture, they like the people, they like even if they like the political system. I think they respond to the impact of the country on their economic prosperity and their security. And in the way I think about the world, if it's soft, it's not power. But then second, we often compare Chinese soft power to American soft power. But I don't think America has very good soft power. In Latin America, of course, there's a long history of Yankee go home and resentment of American presence. In the Middle East, Muslims hate the United States. In Southeast Asia, the Philippines don't particularly like the United States. We have Muslim countries in Malaysia and Indonesia. The Indians aren't particularly fond of us in Africa. So I'm not sure where America gets soft power either. Certainly, much of the world believes that American society and the role of women in American society is unethical. We don't have very good food. Around the world, we don't use soft power, we use hard power with wars in the Middle East and Europe and Bosnia, Latin America. So I think we make a mistake in thinking that China is going to develop soft power to compete with the United States, because I don't think America has soft power. That's very effective. But finally, we are seeing in Southeast Asia and around the world what the Chinese would call a China fever. Everyone is studying Chinese in Africa, in Latin America, in Europe, United States. Why? Because we think that's where the future of the world is. That's where the jobs are, that's where the economy is. And so if you're pragmatic, if you're in Africa, you study Chinese. If you're pragmatic in Latin America and want investment opportunities in China, you study Chinese. And so I think it's not soft power that contributes to other countries' respect. It's that you are successful. And countries have always looked at successful countries and said, what are they doing that contributes to their success? And then they admire it. So I don't think there is much to think about China's soft power and its contribution to investment or power projection. Countries welcome China because China is building railroads and ports. And I think that's the most important thing.
Thank you, Professor Ross. Yes, just a question that I would like to know your opinion regarding the undersea railway that China plans to build in the future to be linked with Taiwan. Yeah, what's your opinion on that?
Well, let's talk about Taiwan's future and Taiwan's relation with the mainland. So the analogy I frequently use is that Taiwan is to China as Cuba is to the United States. Cuba is 90 miles from Florida. Taiwan is 90 miles from China. Cuba is 90 miles from one of the most powerful countries in the world. Taiwan is 90 miles from one of the most powerful countries in the world. Now, I think American policy toward Cuba has been a big mistake, particularly since the end of the Cold War. Cuba doesn't bother anyone, minds its own business. But since 1958, 1959, the price of America's bad policy toward Cuba, the price has been paid for by Cuba, not the United States. The Cuban economy remains backward. Its access to the world remains backward. It's still in poverty. America is punishing Cuba for all the bad reasons and a bad policy, but Cuba's paying the price. So the lesson here is that somehow Taiwan has to find a way to get along with China. There's no alternative. You cannot move Taiwan away from 90 miles from China. Every country in East Asia is finding a way to cooperate with China. South Korea, Vietnam, Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand. South Korea is the only remaining country that has a hostile relationship with China. And we should understand why. This is Taiwan's nationalism. They don't like China. They think China wants to take over their country. They don't like the Chinese Communist Party, and they don't want to become part of China. It's understandable. Why would they want to become part of China? But they still have to find a way to manage China so that they can improve their economy, not have tension, not have problems. Otherwise, their future is bad. And cooperation with the United States is not the answer, because the United States will likely lose a war if it has to fight in the Taiwan Strait. 90 miles from China, China dominates the Taiwan theater, if you will. So today, what are we seeing? We're seeing a president of Taiwan who is a nationalist. She doesn't want to talk about Taiwan as being part of one China. She wants to say, she will never say Taiwan is part of one China. Well, that makes China angry. The prior president, the previous president, said one China, Taiwan part of China. He said Taiwan is the Republic of China. But he said Taiwan part of China. This president won't do that. That means that China is putting pressure on him. But she is a nationalist, so she will not make compromises. And she is using the United States to protect her against Chinese pressure. Because China knows that if there's too much pressure on Taiwan, the United States and China may have a crisis. So she is counting on the United States to prevent China from retaliating against her policy. Over the long run, that can be very dangerous because China has limits. I think it's undeniable it was better for the Taiwan people in their economic growth and in their security when the previous president found a way to get along with Taiwan. When the previous president of Taiwan found a way to get along with China. So I think the future of Taiwan is inevitable, and it's going to have to find a way to cooperate with China. It doesn't have to say, it doesn't have to unify. It can buy lots of weapons. It can defend itself. The United States has never invaded Cuba because it's too expensive. Why bother? Taiwan can become secure without having a fight with China. And if it finds a way to have peace and cooperation with China, it can become a very wealthy country or island by promoting trade and cooperation with minimal tension. Now, the Taiwan people are understandably very nervous about having relations with China that are too close economically. So under the previous president, there was negotiations for a services agreement. The people in Taiwan were very nervous that this meant that people from the mainland could come to Taiwan and open up small stores, shops, hair places, barber shops, beauty parlors, and put all these small Taiwan businesses out of business. And that's understandable. But Taiwan will want to create limits to the mainland's economic presence on Taiwan. A tunnel between Taiwan and the mainland would make it far too easy for Chinese on the mainland to visit Taiwan. No, it would be an hour drive, maybe an hour and a half drive. Some people commute to work every day like that. And so 1.4 billion people makes Taiwan nervous. The mainland has said it would like to build a bridge or a tunnel. I think understandably that makes Taiwan nervous. I think that's a long-range idea, but it's hard to imagine it being successful.
Yes, so I think time is now over. Thank you very much, Professor Ross, for your wonderful lecture and your explanations.
Thank you.
Now, yes, thank you so much. Now to close this event, I give the floor to Professor Aquino. Thank you.
Professor Ross, thanks very much. But I want to abuse my position.
Good.
I cannot resist to ask you a question, Professor. Sorry.
Thank you.
Just very short. What do you think about Xi Jinping? They said Xi Jinping, because of Xi Jinping, China foreign policy is more assertive. The man makes the difference, really. Especially as you know, now that the restriction on the limit of serving a president have been eliminated, and they said Xi Jinping have a big plan in 2035 year, China will be a high-income country. It will reach, some people say, will reach the reunification on Taiwan, and he wants to be there. So how important is Xi Jinping, the man who made the difference for the president?
I think that's an important question. It is too easy in international politics and in political science to say that a country's foreign policy reflects its interests. Leaders matter. It should be obvious that leaders matter. Donald Trump was not Barack Obama. Donald Trump was a disaster because he was Donald Trump. So in China, Xi Jinping is now the president or the party secretary, and he is very, very different than Hu Jintao. Hu Jintao was a very cautious person. He did not take risks. He was not decisive. Xi Jinping is a very decisive person. I do not think he is a big risk taker. He's very careful. But when he decides to take an initiative, he is very decisive and successful. So, for example, look what he did in 2 or 3 years. He challenged the Philippines over Huang Yandao. He created crises he created islands in the South China Sea and then armed them. He sent Chinese ships to challenge Japanese sovereignty over disputed islands in the East China Sea. He announced the Belt and Road Initiative. He created the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. These are major, major initiatives. Now, on the one hand, all of these initiatives and his assertion of Chinese power was possible because of the rise of China. It would not have been possible if China was still trying to develop technology and trying to develop its economy. But how he uses that power, that reflects his own personality. Now, I have to give him credit. He has acted very decisively, major accomplishment, without creating crises, without creating wars, without creating excessive, too much tension. He refuses to compromise, but he refuses to start wars. Now, the second thing to think about Hu Jintao is also his domestic political situation. We used to say that China had collective leadership under Hu Jintao. I don't believe in collective leadership. China had collective leadership because Hu Jintao was weak. He could not make independent decisions, otherwise he would be challenged. So he consulted with everyone to make sure that there was a consensus so he would be safe when he made a decision. Xi Jinping is the most powerful man in China since Mao Zedong. He doesn't need collective leadership. He doesn't need to be cautious in domestic politics. So he's able to use Chinese power in a decisive way. So I think there are two things here. One is his personality, and two are the politics. He's a very strong leader, and that gives him greater flexibility in how to use power. But there's no question, Xi Jinping is very different than Hu Jintao. And there's no question Donald Trump is very different than Barack Obama. Thank you, Professor.
No, thanks, Professor, for your kind answer. Well, limit is over, time is over. Thanks, Professor, for your time. Just before saying goodbye, I want to also say thanks to the many persons who have participated. Professor, we have some diplomats from the Mexican Embassy, the Japanese Embassy. We have also Mr. Juan Carlos Capuñay, former Peruvian ambassador to China, Japan, and some academics from research centers in Peru, Mexico, so they have listened very carefully to your presentation. Very nice. Just before saying goodbye, I would like to announce the next conference. I invite you, all of you, on March 15, Monday at 7 p.m. We will have Professor Shimizu Tatsuya from the Institute of Developing Economics of Japan. He will talk about industrial development based in agriculture, the state of Peru, from a Japanese perspective. And on April 21st at 9 a.m. we will have Professor Steve Tsang, who is the director of the COAS, no? China Institute. He will talk also about China position in the world. I repeat, all this conference is recorded. You can see again in the Facebook page, and I welcome you to visit again and invite you for the next conference. Thanks, Professor. You were very, very kind. And let me take a picture. So please, if you think so, just open your camera so we can have a picture together. Okay.
How do I open my camera?
Okay. 1, 2, 3. Everybody is there. 1, 2, 3. Okay, that's nice. Thanks, Professor.
Thank you very much, and I hope to see you all one day in Lima.
Sure. We welcome you.
Good health to all of you.
Take care, Professor. Take care, everybody. Goodbye, friends. Take care.
Bye-bye.
See you next month. Bye.